I'm Jenya.
I'm Ali.
I'm Sahil.
And
we are Nexus on Air.
The Nexus is an approach that looks at the interdependencies of achieving energy, water, and food security for human well-being and sustainable development. The Nexus on Air podcast asks, how do we understand what the Nexus means in practice? Particularly in a world where people tend to be really focused on their own sectors and their own projects, and where there's just not a lot of headspace to take the lessons learned from what others are doing. We're looking to break down the Nexus concept and to get into really specific examples about how leading practitioners are changing the paradigm. Discussion topics will include solar irrigation, groundwater management, sustainable agriculture, and more. We will unpack how entrepreneurs are bringing new technologies to market, or how program managers are working with communities to manage Nexus components. We'll look at questions around how to measure what sustainability really means, and how to tell if a technology is ready to be scaled, or if it's even appropriate to the context that we're working in. The podcast will look at different topics through different lenses to shed light on the real challenges that practitioners are facing. We want to bring out these stories so that we can all learn from each other as development practitioners, as professionals, and as people who care about achieving good results for our environment and our economy. We want our listeners to get to know us, so we're going to start off the podcast with a round of introductions, and then we're going to spend the rest of this pilot episode telling stories that highlight some of the challenges that we have faced in our own work as Nexus practitioners at the intersection of food, water, and energy.
Hi, my name is Jenya, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Activera. Let me give you a quick background. Before starting the company, I worked in finance at JP Morgan Chase and across various departments, from investment banking to risk management, to my last role was as a vice president in credit portfolio management and research. And it was there that I analyzed and visited many natural resource companies, including ones in energy, agriculture, and water utilities at the time. So fast forward several years and a master's degree later, which we'll tell you about in a second, I found that finance experience quite handy in my now renewable energy work. I used it to structure finance for sectors like cook stoves, briquettes, solar, and more recently, solar for productive use technologies like irrigation and chilling. I guess what I particularly like about linking finance and development backgrounds is blending together the different finance partners. It could be donor agencies with development banks, impact investors, and on to, let's say, more commercial capital. And it was really those two things, the technologies, so solar for productive use more specifically, which I feel strongly about, and the finance component that was the basis really for launching Activera. So today at Activera, which actually stands for enabler or an activator, we focus precisely on that, enabling finance for the Nexus. I guess listening to all this, you may ask how and why and what's the big deal about the Nexus. So let me just reflect back and share one experience, how that came about, before turning it over to my co-hosts over here. So I remember a good few years back standing out on a lakeshore in Rwanda as we were serving solar water pump sites and talking to the farmers. I had some experience with solar pumps at the time that was left there by an NGO, but not exactly how to and where to get more. So we were looking at different distribution models and different business models together. Then all of a sudden, I remember seeing many farmers coming out of their plots and out of their villages and just walking up to meet us and talk to us. And visually that demonstrated the sheer demand for the product to me. And as a finance person, that demand was a good early indicator. However, as a sustainability professional, I immediately felt really uncomfortable with that demand and thinking to myself, what if every farmer now starts pumping water for their current needs and in the future start switching from corn to tomatoes and requiring more water? What will happen to this lake in terms of water withdrawals? Will it even be there in 20 years from now? So immediately I knew that we needed some sort of system of water accounting before starting to implement any projects. I think, again, now looking back, that was exactly when the Nexus thinking hit home to me out in the field, being puzzled by this challenge of looking at the energy provision piece, bringing in transformative agriculture for the households, and then integrating it with sustainable water use, all in one holistic package. And again, you'll hear more about challenges of implementing that as we share them with you in this and later episodes. So let me turn it over to Ali. Ali, why don't you tell us your story?
So, my name's Ali Greenberg. I'm a development practitioner, an agricultural professional, and a co founder of the Development Practice, which is an international development consulting company where we have a particular focus on helping clients with program design, strategy, data insights, and strategic research. We also have sector practices around agriculture and environment. Sahil and I co-founded the company just last year and are getting started with different client work and projects. But my own personal story leading up to that is being from the suburbs of New York City, where doing agriculture work was not a very obvious path. I studied development economics in undergrad and also studied abroad in West Africa, which really opened my eyes to a lot of the global issues that we work on today. I worked on some farms and really became more and more convinced that the way we produce, process, value, eat, and dispose of food could be the basis of creating a more sustainable and equitable global economy. And this is really what I focused my master's degree studies on, where I really dug down deep into the global food systems and into integrated development. And that's where I really came to understand that the nexus is the realization of a better way to think about food systems. An ear of corn in a farmer's field is not just an agricultural product. It's water, meeting sunlight, meeting healthy soil, and a farmer's labor. And it's also the promise of a nutritious dinner and a sustainable livelihood for the farmers who invest that work. The nexus is realizing this context and designing programs that recognize it as well. Sahil and I started the development practice because the organizations that we previously worked at did not always have the time to think about this integrated context. A lot of times we were told to stay in our sectors. At the development practice, we focus on the complexity and the bigger picture. This broader context is often messy. The roadmap and the language still needs to be created and formalized, and that's what Nexus thinking really helps us to do. I'll let my business partner talk a little bit more about the company and this Nexus way of thinking that we've really just embraced.
I am Sahil Gulati, and I'm a co-founder of the Development Practice, where I lead the natural resource and climate change work streams. I am originally from the town of Bhopal in India, where I went to school and started college. My family and I migrated to the Bay Area in California around 15 years ago. A huge lifestyle change. I was amazed by everything. 24/7 hot water, fast food, the sports culture. One thing that I got especially excited by was the infrastructure, highways and bridges. I distinctly remember the day I landed and we took the freeway to go to my aunt's house. I had not seen traffic move so smoothly at over 100 kilometers an hour without honking at each other and bumping into each other. I majored in civil engineering, with which I could see a linkage to the field of international development that always had been my interest. I was quite involved in my college activities and founded the chapter of Engineers Without Borders at my college. And I traveled to Honduras to work on a water project. Such experiences got me more and more excited about working in the space of international development, but not just on projects, on programs and policy that enable such international development initiatives. The food, water, energy nexus excites me because of its intertwined nature and how unknown some of its elements are. to the general population that seems more and more disconnected with this knowledge of natural resources, the key one being groundwater. The invisible nature of groundwater and yet the integral role that it plays in production of food is very interesting to me. Groundwater or aquifers that contain groundwater do not really follow administrative boundaries, and it is a challenge to implement policies to limit the use of groundwater, and therefore it's prone to over extraction. I think that as there is more stress on the global food system, access to groundwater for irrigation will become a key constraint.
So, going back to our roots, as you know now, we all did the same master's program together at Columbia University. It's called MPA in Development Practice. And interestingly, looking back now, I would even call it a Nexus degree. I think for 2009, it was a fairly innovative degree in economic development. It came out as a recommendation from a report by the International Commission on Education that basically highlighted the need for a new quote unquote breed of development practitioners. Basically, people who had their specializations but who were also generalists and fairly well versed in managing expertise across the various disciplines. You could really see that reflected in our academic curriculum. We had classes from hydrology to infrastructure to public health systems, of course, agriculture, and over to education. But to me, the fun part was really the fact that a water engineer like Sahil could sit down with a foodie systems person like Ali and a banker like me, and we could all talk the same common development language. So, can you guys believe that it's been now close to 9 years and each one of us continued to hone in our respective expertise since ag, water, and energy? And as Ali was alluding to earlier, in a more integrated manner, and that's what brings us here today. When the rubber really hits the road and you start implementing this very Nexus thinking in practice, I'm just thinking back on the first teething problems with the solar irrigation sector. So going back to say 2012, you have the new technology that finally became commercially viable and somewhat affordable to the end user. So you kind of have the energy piece solved. Now, going over to integrating water, again, back then, measuring the withdrawals was extremely difficult. Smaller pumps, for instance, didn't have the water meters. Sure, you can install a bigger system where some, not all, had meters, but then you run into the bigger question of group structures. The farmers we worked with, for instance, much rather preferred to own a smaller pump than to share a big system, because then you get into the who waters when, how much issues and logistics of putting the pipes through as well. So that's the demand side of the water equation. Now, hopping over to the supply side, getting data at a project level and reliable enough so that you can actually manage and regulate those daily withdrawals was, again, not easy. Looking over at the ag side, interestingly, we saw the technology allowing farmers to switch to crops that earned a higher income, tomatoes, for instance, which is great. But then the water use grows, and you're back to the supply-demand question we've talked about. And then you also have to manage the supply of that crop carefully so it doesn't all come at the same time and destroy the prices. But I think even more importantly, it's not enough to just put the pump in and expect new crops to flourish. It takes the whole ag extension work, as you know, Ali, to train the farmers on the new methods. Otherwise, there's always that risk of crop failure. Again, the banks watch crop failures very closely as you're trying to introduce finance in the sector, because the biggest risk they face is exactly that when deciding to start crediting the new sector like solar irrigation. So as you can see, it becomes this whole series of these simultaneous equations you need to solve bit by bit in practice. But I'm very optimistic about the future, and since those early days, we do see these issues being solved in very creative ways. So here, I just want to put the plug to our solar irrigation series, which we'll explore, and we'll see precisely how these challenges gave rise to new and very interesting business models that we see today. So do stay tuned.
So, one of the things that Jenny alludes to is this question of measurement, which is something that we've talked a lot about being one of the biggest challenges to Nexus practice itself. At the end of the day, it's great to say that the Nexus should work in theory, but organizations and clients need to show real measurable impacts and results. From the food security and agriculture world, it's easy for agriculture projects to say, we increased yields, or for nutrition programs to say, we treated this many cases of acute malnutrition, and to show measurable results that way. But how do you show the results of a nutrition-sensitive agriculture program? What are realistic targets for ag and nutrition in that case? For me, I always think about this measurement question in food security from a strategy meeting that I had at a hunger alleviation NGO that I worked for. We were developing a technical framework focused on the concept of nutrition security. One of the managers in this meeting just kept insisting that we should minimize our focus on food, on water, on health systems, and on livelihood development, and that we should only focus on emergency nutrition response, since that's what we could easily measure, and that's what we could easily show donors the impact of. We spent days debating this. It was the basis of a 5-year strategy. So we had this week where we were coming up with the strategy. And in the end, we were successful in the debate and going forward with the integrated approach. Only once we could show that there could be clear metrics that the organization could measure, because nutrition security includes water security, and it includes food security, and it includes energy access, and health systems, and productive livelihoods. You can't talk about nutrition security without talking about all of that and coming up with metrics that pull them together, which is what we ultimately did in that case. That measurement question just comes up all of the time across all of the Nexus practices. And I think Sahil has specifically looked at this question in terms of water security.
Thanks, Ali. I'm so excited that as we record this podcast, we will not only get to pick the brains of our experts, but also learn from each other's unique experiences. In 2014, I was a consultant at the Global Green Growth Institute in India, and we were developing the micro irrigation policy for the state of Karnataka. I met with people from various government departments, agronomists to understand horticultural crop requirements, the state electricity board to discuss connections in rural areas, people in the water resources department to get an idea of groundwater availability. But very rarely did these experts have a knowledge of challenges faced by farmers to irrigate their crops. The most practical issues were, of course, raised by farmers. For example, they knew the erratic availability of groundwater, which was a barrier for them to invest in expensive irrigation systems that were dependent on groundwater availability. To tackle the issue of various departments not speaking with each other, our policy implementation roadmap assigned responsibilities and checks to various state government departments that would enable smoother subsidy provision to farmers and private companies for installing drip irrigation. I think that the issue of climate change is forcing people to think about the food, water, energy nexus more holistically. While I was working at the Global Green Growth Institute, we dealt with the Ministry of Environment and Forest, which had just recently changed its name to the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And although in the moment it was just a name change, over the course of next year, we saw that there were some experts that came on board which had an understanding of climate change. The people who worked on mitigation had an idea of energy issues. People who worked on adaptation had good knowledge of water and agriculture and food security. And slowly, when they started talking to each other, it was interesting to see the capacity that was getting built inside the new ministry. You'll see that climate change is a recurring theme in future episodes as well. To give you more details about the podcast, Nexus on Air has multiple topics such as solar irrigation, water management, sustainable agriculture, solar chilling, cook stoves, the urban nexus, climate change adaptation, etc., etc. Each topic will have approximately 5 episodes that explore it from a different lens. For instance, one of our initial topics is water management, which is reviewed by the lenses of exploring the water crisis, measuring impact, policy, gender, and sustainability. Through our backgrounds of working in international development over the last decade, Jenya, Ali, and I have come across experts and practitioners. All of them offer a unique perspective. We will invite such guests to share their experiences and, through our own knowledge of working in development, curate these episodes to present a holistic picture of the topic. We are excited for your suggestions and feedback. You can email us at vrnexusonair@gmail.com. One word, vrnexusonair@gmail.com.
Nexus on Air is executive produced by Zhinia Sokolova of Activera and Ali Greenberg and Sahil Gulati of the Development Practice. Technical, creative, and post-production services are provided by Archetypal Media.